Hey everybody, Dr. Snellgrove here, just recording a quick video about the elements of formal reports. It's in our textbook starting on page 193. And before I get too far into this, I wanted to emphasize, I know I've said this, I think, in previous videos, but just in case there's any confusion, the report that you're working on for our next major assignment, that is an informal report. So some of the stuff that we're going to go over today and that you've probably already read in your textbook don't necessarily apply to the to what you're working on, but the whole spirit of this is, of course, not just to prepare you for the rest of my course, but to prepare you for a career. And depending on where you go, what you end up doing, what you have to write, you may need to demonstrate a mastery of formal reports. All right. And so they have a breakdown of the different elements on 193 that typically go in the formal reports. I'm just going to dive in. I don't want to just read the book to you, but cover some of this stuff and then give you some thoughts on it. And I feel like this is almost always the case, but starting on page 205 or so, the book just descends into different examples of how you can do all this if you are interested. All right. So number one with the bullet here at the bottom of page 193 is talking about prefatory elements. All right. And we talked a lot previously about the idea that when it comes to a report, people skim before they read. And for that matter, more people skim than they read. So this, it points out long, complex reports usually require prefatory elements. All right. So this may include like who it's coming from, who it's going to, the title, table of contents, things like an abstract or a summary that we're going to get into both of those. And I feel like I should take the opportunity to point out that, you're probably taking this class and you're thinking, I don't know that much about formal reports, but the idea of some of what we're talking about are things that you have most likely seen in some of your academic research. It's not uncommon at all for especially scientific papers, to have a summary of like, all right, here's what we did, here's what the experiment was, here's what the findings were. And even in the humanities, lots of papers about literature, they have a little abstract at the beginning. And all of that is there. I'm not speaking too bluntly, but all of that is there so readers know whether or not they are wasting their time with your writing. And it's honestly, as students, you've probably had that same feeling countless times before, where it's like, oh, wow, here's this 20-page, article from a journal. Is this actually relevant to what I'm researching? Well, in a perfect world, it'll have some info up front, where you can figure that out. And that's exactly what you're doing here when you add, a summary or some kind of abstract. All right. And so the book, I think this goes without saying, but they point out that the effectiveness of the report begins with the effectiveness of the elements that state the content. Many readers may decide to read the body of the report if they find the prefatory elements compelling. That's what we were just talking about. The idea that, they're not necessarily going to dive in and start reading page after page. They're going to look at everything up front, figure out, is this relevant? Is this helpful to me? If not, they move on. All right. So some of this stuff, the book has a lot of granular detail that you don't necessarily need every syllable of. Like it talks about top of page 194, the letter/memo of transmittal. And it's just like, hey, who is this sent to? And they do point out that it may be read by people other than whom it was originally sent to. So you might have something that is sent to the CEO of your workplace because they have requested it, but ultimately, it ends up being something people have to read for various meetings or whatnot. Other cases, the transmittal letter can address the person who's authorized and requested the information. All right. So they're spinning a lot of words to say, sometimes you're addressing that to the boss. Sometimes you're addressing it to someone lower in the hierarchy that is the actual person that has requested you provide this info. either way, other people than the original person are going to end up reading this as well. All right. So what do you have here in the letter/memo of transmittal? It's like, all right, subject and purpose of the report and the reason for the report. And then optionally, there's several different documents and things you can include. Background material. This is a complex subject where you got to bring up to speed, but you include background info. Mention of earlier reports. Are you doing something completely fresh, or more commonly, you're building on stuff that has come before? And so this is a chance to, bring them up to speed again with what's come before. Information that may be of special interest or significance to readers, of course. And I've tried to draw distinctions between what you're doing in this paper and, say, the traditional academic essay. But this is one of those areas where there's a little bit of shared DNA with what you would put in the background section of a paper. It's like, all right, info that may be of special interest or significance. And the idea being, hey, they're not necessarily going to appreciate or even understand the rest of this down here if they don't get this info up here. But that's honestly what you're doing when you're writing intros to your papers in various classes. Like, all right, I got to choose the right background info and make sure my reader is on the same page as me. Specific conclusions/recommendations that might be of special interest to the person to whom the report is addressed. So this is one of the, we've talked about this before, but this is one of those big differences between this and academic writing. It's like, no, we're not waiting for them to get to the conclusion to see how you wrap things up. May very well be putting your conclusion/recommendation on page 1 as part of this. It gives, again, people can scan it and figure out, does this pertain to me? Is this relevant to me? Okay. Financial implications, of course, that's usually why you would be compiling some kind of report. It's like, all right, we're worried about something that is affecting the company's bottom line. So this is have financial details if you needed or wanted to include it. And finally, acknowledgments, list of those who provided help in the project, which is basically, no project is an island. It's very rare that one person does literally 100% of the work. So if people helped you out, this is where you'd shout them out. It is optional in the context of a formal report, but hey, it never hurts to make a few friends at work. And by acknowledging their contributions, you can do that. All right. So let's see. They point out that you can check out the Case 8.1 report to see a good transmittal memo. All right. Title page. And the title page has potentially a lot of info. I'm glad that your book pointed this out. It's like many organizations have a standard format for title pages. So they go over everything, and I'll try to go over everything kind of quicker. But the long story, not very short there, is like, what do I need to include there? Well, whatever the company is asking you to include is what you need to include. But things that are often included on a title page, your name, basically, possibly with a signature, the name of the company or course for which the report was prepared, title and subtitle of the report, date of submission, code number of the report, contract numbers under which the work was performed, company or agency logo, proprietary and security notices, names of contacts / responsible individuals, and then descriptive abstract. So it's a lot of stuff is going on there on that title page. But again, this is kind of like a deliberately wide open. Here's a bunch of things that might pop up in your own title page, type stuff. But it all ultimately you're deferring to whatever company you work for. Like, what do you want my title pages to look like? All right. Submission page includes a list of contributors to the report and or names and signatures of the authorizing officer or projected leader. Submission pages emphasize the point we make throughout this book. Reports require accountability. Signatures on a submission page indicate the authors stand behind the content. The submission page usually either precedes the title page or follows it. Alternatively, the title page and submission page may be combined. So your book is pointing out how often it points this out. I guess I haven't pointed this out as often as I could, but yeah, a lot of this, organizations are all about hierarchy. Who does what? Sometimes past tense, who did what? That kind of thing. And so it's like, all right, well, need to have this here. Like who compiled this? Who helped with this? Do they stand by what they've said here. Table of contents is a very literal, like, what can we expect in here? It should contain all of your major headings. And I don't want to just beat the dead horse in the glue in front of you, but as the book points out, people should be able to skim a table of contents and get a strong idea of what your paper is about. All right. Now, this is completely optional for our report purposes. I mean, this is an element of a formal report anyway, although there's ways you could slip this stuff into an informal report. But list of illustrations. This can include tables, graphics, drawings, photos. So you might have a page labeled illustrations or exhibits with all the visuals on there. And so I keep drawing these weird little connections to work that you might have done before, but that is something very similar to an appendix page in MLA, where it's like, all right, I've got here's a bunch of visual elements I've included and I'm going to make reference to in my graded report because I think it's going to clarify some of what I'm talking about. All right, glossary and list of symbols. This is probably rare. I mean, it depends on what kind of report you're writing. But your book points out reports dealing with specialized subject matter. That may include abbreviations, acronyms, symbols, and terms not known to readers outside a specialized group. Readership should determine if a glossary or list of symbols is needed. We'll circle back to that. Okay, yeah. So the idea of explaining some kind of glossary like that, one of the reasons that's so important, one of, I think maybe the first, I don't know if it's the first thing, it's close, that we talked about is it's important to determine your audience, because you need to know what they know and you need to know what they don't know, because, well, that informs what you tell them. And that can be very important. And some of you, I'm preaching to the choir here, but organizational hierarchy, where like maybe you're part of the engineering team and y'all live, breathe, eat, engineering stuff. But then eventually you have to prepare a report for the CEO or other like C-suite executives. Well, at that point, they don't speak that language. They speak their own weird little language, but they don't really speak that engineering language. So they would benefit from some kind of glossary, some kind of like, here's what the specialized terms are. Here's what you need to know. All right. So moving right along, abstracts and summaries. Let's see. The book, again, with characteristic bluntness. The title page, table of contents, abstract, and summary may, in fact, be the only parts of the report that many recipients read. So there's two things going on there, at least two things. One, it's obviously very important for you to get that information, make it good, make it something that gets their attention, makes them want to continue reading. But at the same time, it's also informative enough that somebody can figure out sooner rather than later if this applies to them or not. Like, is this useful for me or not, relevant to me or not? All right. So they point out, I've been using these terms differently or in different sections, the same way your book is, but they point out that the abstract usually is right after a title page or even on the title page. All right. And summaries may also follow the title page. All right. And the terms are not interchangeable. Basically, abstracts are a bit shorter and a bit less in detail versus a summary, which is a little more intensive, a little more data driven. All right, the book has some helpful stuff here. We're on 196 if you've been following along. So abstracts may be informative or descriptive. So abstracts often have keywords that you use for online indexes and databases. All right. And it's kind of interesting to me. The book focuses on the idea of locally stored information, right? Like, we may have to have certain keywords because later somebody at work is going to be trawling through these databases and they need to be able to search for these terms. But these days it's kind of a double duty, because if you have any kind of report that might appear online, or if you just might be in charge of any kind of like online writing or marketing, it's important to know this is how keywords work as well. It's like, it's not just getting the information out there, but getting the information out there in a way that it's easy for people to look up, when they are curious about it. All right. So anyways, yeah, we talked about that. Differences. I mean, book just keeps hitting like it's abstract should be well written. I mean, I get that they had to pad out the text a little bit on here, but I'm just like, I would hope all of this stuff will be well written, like, ultimately, because we're not just talking about school anymore. We're talking about like your job, your life is on the line, your ability to put food on the table. But yeah, please make it a good one. All right, so they have recommendations here, like how do I even plan an abstract? It's like, well, I need subject/purpose, methods, findings or results, conclusions/recommendation. All right, and so this is kind of a two birds one stone thing, or it can be, where it's like, hey, here's stuff that these are maybe headers. These are some of the same headers that I'm using in my overall report, but I'm also what do you call it? I'm putting those things in the abstract. So you can either think of it as I'm creating the abstract and I'm also outlining part of my report, or I'm outlining part of my report and I'm helping to create the abstract, whichever one you want to think of there. All right, so informative abstracts. It's just like, what are the research objectives, methods, findings, conclusions? They may or may not have recommendations. So I always think about the old show/movie Dragnet. That's the facts, ma'am. What goes in an informative abstract? Well, just these crucial bits of information. How does that compare though to a descriptive abstract? It's like what topics the full report contains. This is kind of interesting. Unlike informative abstracts, descriptive abstracts cannot serve as a substitute for the report itself. They begin with the report purpose and then explain content areas or topics covered in the report. So there's an example of that in figure 8.3. All right. So I guess reading between the lines, your book doesn't really spell this out, but what kinds of abstracts would you be creating for your own professional reports when you are in a career field? And it almost always depends on the boss. I mean, you could end almost every sentence in this book that way. It depends on the boss. But the idea, some people just want a to the point, informative abstract. Some people want you to put a little more riz on it with a special, descriptive abstract. It's just important to know what the boss wants, and that informs how you go about doing it. All right. And then finally, we have executive summaries. This is still technically in the top half on 198. Executive summaries are meant to be read by, you guessed it, executives like the CEO and other C-suite folks. So what do you do in the executive summary? It has all the information listed at the beginning of the chapter, as well as like extensive development of each information segment to provide decision makers the information they need without having to read or search the full report. Figure 8.4 gives an example of an executive summary that does just this. It says, even though you know nothing about this project, which in this case is from a state study of shrub control on rangeland, even though you know nothing about this project, the executive summary will provide you with extensive information. In many proposals, the summary often determines whether the proposal itself will be read. All right. So again, reading not so between the lines there. The idea here is your boss doesn't have time to read all that. Your big boss, your team manager, maybe, but you might compile in some cases a very lengthy report. And just when the smoke clears, you can't necessarily count on the CEO or these other major decision makers to read that thing from top to bottom. So the executive summary is like, here's all the info plus some extra info that might help you make a decision. So it's sort of, I hate to say it this way, like I'm a bootlicker, but I was going to say, this is kind of what separates your executives, or what sets your executives apart here. Because I keep saying that everybody skims info, and they do. That's not like limited to executives, but Executives might be some of the only people that skim the info and then immediately have to make a business decision. So the executive summary is kind of like a weird half-assed compromise there, where it's like, all right, I know you skimmed down, but skimming didn't give you all the info. So here's all the info you need in order to make a reasonable and informed decision about the course of action. All right. So starting on the bottom of 198, going to, I guess, the bottom of 199, because of that big executive summary over there, discussion or body of the report. So as with the informal report, the formal report, most of it should be the body, like what is going in here. So it's like, and I like your book's terminology here. Think of it as discussion. It's like, all right, it's going to explain in detail stuff you think readers need to know, stuff that contextualizes this matter, what your purpose is, what your objectives were, your methods, your findings, pretty much all of it. And the book points out kind of the no-duh thing. Without the discussion, you can't really write an effective summary or abstract. Those things are summarizing and abstracting the larger report. So this is, I feel like I mutter about this all the time eventually, but this is another case where it's genuinely easier to jump into the middle of it, I would say, and then go back than it is to like, all right, let me go ahead and write my summary and abstract for this paper that I haven't written yet. That's just genuinely difficult to do, no matter how good a writer you are. All right, so got all that info. Let's see, looking at the top of 200. And so they point out I feel like your book just keeps finding ways to point this out, that the discussion is the report segment read least. And that doesn't mean it's unimportant. It's like, as we just said, if you didn't have that in place, you couldn't do the abstract or summary or any of the rest of it. But it all goes back to like, you're laying this out in such a way that the average person can immediately look at this, skim through, see the important sections, and discover if they want to dive in more. So it's really only a handful of people that would dive into the bulk of what you're doing. Most people arguably would skim through like, oh, this doesn't pertain to me, I don't care about it. CEOs would skim through, they get to that executive summary, like, all right, tell me what I need, what do I need to do? And then it's really just a handful of like very driven, very curious, individuals that are going to be reading every single line of all this fun stuff. All right. So what do you do in the discussion section? A lot of this is similar to what you're doing in the informal section here, informal reports. So it usually starts with an introduction, but it's okay to blend the introduction and the summary together. Gets the reader on board. What is the subject and purpose of your report? And so they say you can look at the figure 8.5 for an example of this. We get to see the topic, the rationale, the development plan, all of it. And it's because of the length of the introduction, the writer partitions the parts of the intro with headings. And so that's just a friendly reminder. Some people love this, some people hate this, but a friendly reminder that you can do almost anything with this. Like, your ultimate goal is clarity. My audience should immediately understand what the heck I'm talking about here. And so if you need to make a call like that, like, I'm going to split my introduction up into these little parts because I know my audience is going to have an easier time digesting that, that's fine. That is literally a-okay. All right, so we got all that fun info down. Points out the report, the intro should include report subject, purpose, plan of development. Some reports place the background and scope in separate sections after the intro if they are big enough. Otherwise, you can merge them together. But again, like, your book, I don't think uses this terminology. I don't think they prefer this terminology, but what you're really talking about there is producing a text where it's like, all right, I have already written this at least in a raw form. And in addition to just checking for grammar and refining that kind of thing, double checking my research, there's also an extra level of this from like, what can I do to XYZ parts of this report to make it easier for my reader to understand them? All right. So they have some stuff on page 202, and I swear we're almost done. Y'all like, when's this manual stop talking? Collecting and grouping information. And so this is just like pattern recognition 101. You know, when you first are compiling info for your report, it's well, I'd mess my camera up if I tried to lean it out. I was gonna say it would be like this cluttered desk that's all around me. You know, you got all sorts of stuff you're bringing in. But then as you're going through it, like I said, it's pattern recognition. It's like, well, hey, this thing and this thing are not exactly the same, but they're pretty similar. We should probably group them together. So it's like the book recommends trying to figure out, like, all right, what are the different categories of stuff that I'm even going over in here? And then develop and they point out this is a dealer's choice thing for you guys. You may want to develop your report according to major sections like intro, topic, followed by topics or categories, which honestly, that's the default for, I would argue that's the default for most people, but it's particularly the default for, what you call it? It's I had it there and I lost it. Yeah, I was gonna say it's kind of like the default for academic papers as well. It's like, all right, we've got intro at the top, followed by, you know, more extensive information here. Well, it's very different than an academic paper, something I keep coming back to, but in principle, you are still grouping this information together. It's like, all right, here's the intro with the background, contextual info that you might need, and then we're diving into the meat and potatoes. All right, so it says, yeah, we've already talked about that. All right, so I don't know if we necessarily need to get into topical arrangement. I mean, I'm not trying to be lazy. I'm looking at the very last sections on 203 going into 204. And it just talks about how you might arrange the information in there. And so you can go in basically a logical order or a chronological order. And so what we mean by that is logical order. You have used your own judgment as a writer, as a researcher, as a subject matter expert to determine this is the order I want to put my information in. In some cases, I'm one of them. Writers like not that writers aren't people, writers might prefer to put stuff in what's called emphatic order. Like I'm putting information in order from least important to most important. And even though it's all supposed to be important, some is more important than others, and I create a little hierarchy. And I would argue that's what most people do, but the alternative is they have a chronological arrangement. So this can be helpful if you're writing a formal report where you're like recommending a course of action. It's like, well, first we need to do this. Or maybe you're going over like, all right, how do we get to this point? What caused this problem for the company? It's like, well, here's what happened, 15 years ago, and here's what happened 12 years ago, and here's what happened 10 years ago. It's that kind of chronological order where you start from the past and work your way towards the future. All right, so like I said, again, friendly reminder, your own reports are informal reports. So I have a previous video that's focusing on informal reports. Of course, getting feedback out on those assignments on Canvas. As always, if you have any questions, though, about any of this, feel free to text me at 863-835-2399, or feel free to email me. Y'all have a good one. Bye.